We were talking about Berlin last time, and I think we ought to take a minute to focus on the life in Berlin in the 1940s and 50s, just a few years after World War II. I arrived in Berlin in February 1949 in the midst of the Berlin blockade by the Soviets. And life in Berlin was very unusual, somewhat problematical, but never doubtful. In other words, the Americans, working closely with the German administration, were determined to survive, resist the blockade, and would not yield to the Soviet demand of ousting the Western allies from Berlin and incorporating possibly West Berlin. About Berlin last time, and I think we ought to remind ourselves of how unique those years were. So shortly after World War II, with the city still in utter ruins, some buildings with macabre I'm stuck. Just plain. We were talking about Berlin last time, and I think we ought to reflect on the exciting and unique life in Berlin was during the blockade which the Soviets imposed on Berlin in summer of 1948, and life in the city in West Berlin was affected in many ways by that blockade. For instance, there wasn't enough gas and oil and coal available for heating houses, so these resources were restricted, what's the word?
Rationed.
That's the word. Were rationed fairly severely, so that most people had perhaps 2 hours of gas any time of day or night. Light could not be used. People used candles, and so in every way life was very somber, very different, except quite exciting too, because Berliners were determined to resist the Soviets and the communist regime in East Berlin. The city itself was still much of it at least, in ruins, and one could see during a walk around the Tiergarten or downtown, one could see houses with the whole facade broken down, and people carrying on their daily chores in the open, and sometimes with bathtubs hanging from the open walls, and people sitting on the exposed floors with their laundry dangling and so on. Very, very, very different. And the strange thing is that I didn't feel it was so very unique. One took it in one stride. But of course it was unique, especially when the Marshall Plan was promoted by the United States to rebuild Western Europe, including West Germany and West Berlin. Reconstruction was proceeding at a fast pace, so that in a few years the ruins would be replaced by either repaired or new buildings. It was lucky that when we were so restricted in our movements if we wanted to go from Berlin to West Germany, we had to go through the Soviet zone, which was always a very unpleasant adventure, because the Russian soldiers would demand our documentation, and there were stories of Western travelers being kidnapped, disappearing, and so on. When one drove through and reached the other side of the Autobahn at Helmstedt, we always breathed a sigh of relief to have gotten through the Soviet zone, where life was totally repressed and forced into the Soviet model. That was also the time when people came from East Germany to West Berlin to sell some of their treasures. They brought silver and porcelain and also books. And this was the time when the auctions, especially Gerd Rosen's auction in West Berlin, featured rare old books, which I soon frequented whenever possible to acquire some rare books. That passion for rare books started when I went to a bookstore called Der Bücherwurm, and I asked the owner of the store, a certain Dr. Hamann, did he have any old books in that store? And he said, well, not really, but you can look in the back and at the stacks and see whether you find anything. And I found a volume published in, where was it, in 1508 or so, containing Lorenzo Valla's oration on the elegance of the Latin language. It was bound in a wooden cover with some pigskin, with a pigskin backing, I think. And I asked Dr. Hamann, how much is this book? And he said, oh, 25 mark, 25 marks, which was equal to about $6 those days. I couldn't believe my ears. So I took it home, and I thought, now this is the sort of rare book that I might have used at Harvard in the rare book room, and I could never dream of owning such a book. And here I had it in my own hands, and I read about an auction being given every once in a while with more of such books. So when an auction came up, Margaret and I would go down to preview the items, and I would tell Margaret just what to bid for when the auction took place, because I would have to stay at my office, of course. And so Margaret and I became a familiar figure to the auctioneer, because we were always there bidding for old items, and Margaret got most items that I urged her to bid for. And that was the start then of acquiring a collection of Renaissance and Reformation books, which I cherished for all the years ahead, and of which my son Greg made some very fine photographs of title pages and other attractive items of the books. And I used those slides for several lectures on early books and rare book collections and so on. So that was one of the permanent experiences and riches that we gathered from our Berlin years. But there was another aspect to Berlin. First of all, of course, the human factor. We had very good Berlin friends, partly through the Free University, both students as well as faculty, and among the American community. We had many good friends, and there was something like a Berlin spirit, different from West Germany would be different from anywhere in the world, I think, because of this common experience of the blockade. And I shall never forget May 12th, 1949, when the blockade was lifted. People were racing from West Berlin, especially journalists, of course, to West Germany, to Helmstedt, to experience the new the new freedom of driving on the Autobahn. I didn't actually go myself on the 12th, but we went fairly soon after that. And the look at the landscape and the houses and so on in East Germany was a very depressing one. One thinks of East Germany, especially of the villages and towns, as gray. Everything is gray, it lacks color. And the bridges, I never forget, the big bridge over the Elbe River was rickety. They built an auxiliary wooden bridge, I believe. Sometimes we'd see Russian tanks going over. And the Soviets, in fact, claimed that we couldn't drive through East Germany because of the broken down bridges. In other words, technical difficulties prevented our driving through. Of course, it wasn't that at all. There was an auxiliary bridge, but the Soviets used it as a pretext for blockading Berlin. Well, at any rate, the blockade was over, and I remember how we all said to each other, now we've got Stalin by the tail, now you'll have to grant us or guarantee us freedom of traffic through East Germany. Conferences took place between the Allies about the status of Berlin and so on, and unfortunately no written guarantee was secured from the Soviets, and we were very frustrated and angry even at the impotence of the Western statesmen in imposing their demands on the Soviets at this juncture. And Berlin continued to be a problem in international relations for years to come, especially when Khrushchev was in power in the late 50s. He started another Berlin crisis by demanding the neutralization of West Berlin, but that comes later. Life in Berlin, however, was also very much refreshed and enriched by the fact that Berlin has such vast tracts of forest, including, of course, the well-known Grunewald. We lived only about 2 blocks from the Grunewald when we lived on Im Dol in Dahlem, and could enjoy the beautiful fir and pine forests and lakes and ponds of the Grunewald, which compensated somewhat for the restricted life we led with regard to the outside world.
Where did you live when you first moved to Berlin?
We lived in, of course, first I lived as a bachelor with friends from the American community, the Franklins, Esther and gosh, I can't think of his name, Harry Franklin. I had a 3rd floor bachelor's apartment on Gelferstrasse, it was, within walking distance of the American headquarters, my office. And when I met Margaret and we enjoyed our walks through the Grunewald and attending plays and concerts together and so on, things developed in the course of 1949 to the point of deciding to get married.
How did you meet Margaret?
At a party given by the Franklins. And I talked to this lady from Lincoln, Nebraska, of course, who was running a Nachbarschaftsheim, or settlement house in Neukölln. We started to talk a little bit about that, and she said, we have a very nice Gemeinschaft there. I thought that's unusual for an American to use that word. I was right away interested in this person who seemed to talk German very, very ably. And one thing led to another, and we decided to get married. But of course, the basic problem behind all this was the fact that Penny, my wife, declined to follow me to Berlin and demanded separation and ultimately divorce. That was a very painful experience for me, and it took all the sympathy and tactfulness on the part of Margaret to share this experience with me. But when we made the decision to get married, the other decision also had been felt before. In other words, the decision to divorce. It was an especially painful experience because it meant loss, possibly permanent loss, of the children, Christopher and Michael. And whenever I saw young children like that in Berlin, I felt a pain in my heart that I didn't have those little boys anymore. But Margaret helped me get over this difficult period. And we got married in late December 1949. Well, you asked me where did we live in Berlin. So after having lived at the Franklins as a bachelor, we now were assigned a very beautiful house by the American administration on Im Dol. And it was a very cozy as well as attractive house in a rural, or rather in a rustic environment, with pines growing before and after, behind the house, and with a lovely balcony. And one mustn't forget also the cheerful and competent help coming from our housekeeper, Lina, who was devoted to us as well as to the babies that soon arrived, Susie and Greg, and Susie in 1950, Greg in 1952. During those years, of course, we also occasionally broke out of West Berlin and went traveling in West Germany and in foreign countries. These were unforgettable experiences. Still, shortly after World War II, and the effects of the war could be seen in many of the cities that we visited. I think our first trip took us to southern Germany and northern Switzerland in the midst of winter. And the slides which we have from that trip still tell the story of of life adjusting to the post-war conditions.
This was
But,
winter of 1950.
1950, that's right.
Did Susie go
And
along?
we drove in Margaret's green job, which needed special medical care every once in a while because something would conk out, either the carburetor or some other innards. At any rate, it served us well in any case as we traveled through Switzerland. And I think we hoped to go to Vienna, but we didn't make it. Other trips in those years involved driving to Scandinavia, Denmark, which was my first visit of Scandinavia. Denmark appearing like one vast garden, beautifully cultivated, civilized, and on the whole unhurt by the war. And Sweden, which in some ways in its vast rural scenery resembled the United States, I thought. Red barns and vast forests, tidy fields and so on. But of course, the cities like Stockholm and these, like Oslo also, had gave the impression of modernity, good taste, cultivated and civilized life. One thing I meant to mention in connection with the blockade, by the way, was that one walked in the dark at night because there was no electricity available. Street lights were out, and one heard the steps of others on the streets but couldn't see anybody. And in this environment, you would think that there might be criminals trying to rob you or worse. Nothing of the sort happened. No crime that I can recall during those dark days. And it just shows that life can be peaceful, harmonious, and productive even under those strange circumstances. Perhaps even because of those circumstances, because it stimulated one's vigor, one's experience. And it's an experience I'll never forget. Well, back on our travels, we did get to Italy on, I think that was the second trip to Milan, where Margaret was visiting a friend of hers. Let's see. Nell Tangeman, a singer. And I went down to Rome.
Rolling.
That our first trip to Italy in 1950 was unique in many ways. First of all, of course, it was the rediscovery of Italy, which I had known mostly through pictures and reports, but now I saw them in the flesh, so to speak, in reality. And like the old books which I experienced at the Harvard Rare Book Library, Italy now was a country that I had grown to love and admire from literature, art history, and now one would experience it in reality. Unforgettable.
What year were you in Italy?
That was 1950.
Did the kids go along on these trips?
There were no kids as yet, Greg. But Margaret was very visibly pregnant, and how she survived these strains of traveling in Italy and Florence, San Gimignano, and some of those places in rickety buses is really beyond me. But she carried herself, and the future Susie very capably. Nothing untoward happened. As I said, she also visited her friend in Milan while I went on to Rome, and we decided eventually to meet, or quite soon, I guess, in Verona, which was which we saw for the first time in our lives. I had been in Italy before this in 1946, but very briefly. But now to discover Verona was a very wonderful experience, because Verona is far north and shares some of the characteristics of Switzerland and Austria in its cleanliness and beautiful architecture. What I never forget about Verona is the red brick architecture with white marble frames and encasements. It seems that even the sidewalks were paved in red, and marble curbs, very beautiful and neat, with the clean blue waters of the Adige flowing through the city, and with a magnificent fortress on the other side of the shore. Incidentally, the meeting of Margaret and myself at Verona took place just according to schedule. She came by train, I came by train. Worked out beautiful. You might ask, well, where was the car? We had driven the green job again. It broke down once or twice on the way, and we decided to leave it in Innsbruck and go on from there by train. The car would hopefully be repaired by the time we returned to pick it up, which was the case. But the green job was becoming more and more problematical, so in the next year, I think 1951, we acquired a new car, a Chevy, black Chevy, very formal and elegant looking, which unfortunately we had to leave in Berlin when we departed at the end of 1952. Well, that brings up the question, how long should one stay at a foreign post and in a job like mine, which was obviously temporary because our administration wouldn't last forever. And besides that, I had been out of teaching for more than 2 years, and I had to ask myself, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Well, the answer, of course, was obvious. Go back to teaching. So in December 1952, in a way with a very heavy heart, we packed our belongings, got them ready to ship back to the United States, because one had to get back to one's academic career within reasonable time in order to get appointments. But actually, the end of 52 was the worst possible time for an academic job, because the market just wasn't there. And as far as possible government was concerned, we arrived at a time when the Truman administration came to an end, and new hirings, new appointments, so on, were very scarce or not available. So when we returned to the United States, Margaret and the children, now there were 2 of them, with Susie and Greg, went to the parents in Lincoln, Nebraska, while I stayed in Cambridge, trying to do a little writing and hoping to find a job through the Harvard Placement Bureau. I also had lined up a number of speeches at various colleges in the East, talks on life in Berlin, and East Germany, and so on, hoping, of course, that some of these talks might lead to appointments. Unfortunately, they didn't. But one day I got a telephone call from Philadelphia, from the director of the Carl Schurz Foundation, asking me if I'd be willing to accept a job with the Carl Schurz Foundation in Philadelphia. I thought this was just the right thing to do, even though I had hoped for academic work, but as an interim, this foundation job seemed promising. Got me in touch again with many of the people that were involved in German-American relations and cooperation, many of which I knew through my previous job. So in, I think it was June 1953, we gathered in Swarthmore, where I was able to get a faculty apartment through a friend. Von Lauer was his name, son of a Nobel Prize physicist in Berlin. And we enjoyed our life in Crum Ledge, as it was called. Crum because the little river that flowed by was called the Crum, and the ledge was the platform, so to speak, on which a few faculty houses were situated. We lived in a rather rustic, beautiful environment in that period, while I commuted to Philadelphia to my office by train. My office was located, by the way, in a historic building called the Second Bank of the United States, built somewhere around 1820 in a classical style, just one block from Independence Hall. So I absorbed some of the history and beauty of that part of Philadelphia, especially due to the fact that the director, Howard Elkington, was a prominent member of the Friends, and we went to the Friends meeting house and dining room and so on occasionally, as well as to other places such as Alfred's Alley and other historic streets. So that was in a way a rather productive period, except my work didn't lead to anything. My work really involved raising funds and gathering more memberships for the Carl Schurz Foundation. But I wasn't really suited for that kind of work. So that when in the summer of 1954, a telegram reached me from the University of Iowa asking whether I would be interested in accepting a visiting professorship at the university to teach courses in modern European history, and especially in Russian history, because the person whose place I would be taking was a prominent Russian specialist. Well, with some trepidation, especially because of the Russian history part of the assignment, I accepted the invitation, thinking this might lead me back to academic work, to the great disappointment of the staff of the foundation, who hoped I would stay on. At any rate, in the summer of 1954, we departed with all our belongings to Iowa City, on the way stopping at Cotuit at Cape Cod to spend a few vacation days with Lily Peck. Very lovely lady, and Bill Kirk, I think, was also there at the time, and I played tennis with Bill Kirk, and I still remember the powerful forehands that he hit to me, almost dangerously. So, but all in good spirit, as Bill Kirk, of course, always is. Good cheer and kindness. and competence. At any rate, we left Cotuit, and almost as a departure present, we left a storm behind the next day when the waves destroyed some of the boats and houses along the shore. I guess it was actually a hurricane, 1954. And we reached Iowa City a few days later and lived in a house, once again beautifully situated, not far from the campus, and very close to the zoo where we heard the peacocks and other animals occasionally. And our children were old enough now to enjoy playing outdoors and indoors. And we had a lovely garden right on the edge of the woods. And as far as the work at Iowa City, at the University of Iowa was concerned, the environment was pleasant, the faculty, colleagues were pleasant, but I never felt very comfortable about teaching Russian history without knowing the language. And some of my students were actually learning Russian too, and were trying to read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and others in Russian. And I was, of course, totally hampered by my ignorance of the Russian language. But it was a one-year assignment, and the question came up, what next? By this time you notice that there's a pattern of Wanderlust, so to speak, of going places, staying for a while, changing again, going to another place, restless in a way, seizing the opportunities as they came, and fortunately they did come again and again at crucial moments, so that I was never really unemployed, which was a status that many of my colleagues were in. Jobs in academia were simply not available in that period of 53, 54 and thereabouts. So close to the end of spring of 55, I had to ask myself, do I want to stay in Iowa or do I look for a job elsewhere? And we received a letter from a friend we knew in Berlin, Chris Legge, who had been director of the America House in Berlin, and who had moved to Beirut, the American University of Beirut, as a librarian. And in his letter he said, why don't you come to Beirut? They probably need somebody, and the environment is interesting. It's unique perhaps, but very interesting and rich. So, nothing daunted, I wrote a letter to the history department, asking for a possibility of an appointment. And lo and behold, they said, why don't you go to an interview at the University of Chicago, Professor Wilson of the Oriental Institute, I think it was, which I did. And I think the professor got a fairly favorable impression. And the next thing was that I was offered a job as associate professor of history at the American University in Beirut. A very radical decision, a very radical departure indeed. I never dreamt of going to a third world country. But the fact that it was an American institution of some repute, almost 100 years old, and the fact that I never had been exposed to that kind of environment led us to decide that we would go there for a 3-year appointment. We first went to Lincoln, leaving, among other things, the whole collection of rare books, because I didn't want to take those along, and saying goodbye to the parents. And off we went by train to New York City and boarded the Exocorda of the American Express line. That was a lovely trip because not only was the ship very well equipped with pleasant company on the whole, not a very large ship, but it had a swimming pool and other facilities. Didn't go too fast because it stopped at various places in the Mediterranean. And that was a very enriching experience because the first stop was Marseille, and then we went ashore, of course, and took a bus excursion to Avignon and various other southern places. I think perhaps you remember Avignon when you and Susie went into a little carriage pulled by a mule right in front of the old medieval palace of the popes. There was also the Pont d'Avignon, sur le Pont d'Avignon, which people sang about across the Rhone River, an ancient broken bridge on which people danced on certain occasions. At any rate, a very fascinating town. Not to forget the special wine which was brewed there, the Chateau du Pape, and so on. I think we also went to, I forget, Arles. I think we did go to Arles with its Roman ruins and other attractions. Van Gogh country it was. Very sunny, very bright, very dry, fascinating. And from Marseille, then the steamer took us to Naples. And in Naples, we took a bus excursion along the Amalfi Drive, which was one of those breathtaking roads almost on the sheer cliffs over the Mediterranean. We, of course, visited Pompeii outside of Naples. I remember you children walking along with Mother slowly, exploring things while I went ahead and tried to move you on a little faster so we wouldn't miss the bus. But at any rate, these were very exciting short trips. There was still one more trip before we came to Beirut, and that was Alexandria, Egypt, where we all got into a carriage, pulled not by a camel but by a horse. And perhaps you remember the Arabs on the shore that were trying to sell things to the passengers on the ship. I forget what words they used, but very loud, characteristic Arab sounds. We got a real introduction into Arab life there. As we drove through the streets, we saw vendors with fruits and baked goods, and especially trays of Lebanese, or rather Arab bread, which they carried on their head, and amid conditions that didn't seem entirely sanitary either. But at any rate, we also went, I think we did go to the pyramids. Or no, I guess we didn't get out to the pyramids on that occasion because we didn't go to Cairo. We stayed in Alexandria. And then the next stop, of course, was Beirut. And there on the dock were the friends, Chris Lake and his wife, waving to us. And after we got off, they took us to their house. And that was, to me, also a unique experience. A house with large Gothic-like windows, actually Turkish style, I guess. They were the house of Chris Lake, with directly on the water with a view of the sea and the Lebanese mountains in the distance. I thought this was just unbelievably beautiful and unique to be able to live in such an environment. Well, after having been received at the Lakes House, one of the faculty ladies, Mrs. McDonald, came with her station wagon and took us to our future apartment in Beit Shapir. What was it? The name of the house? Beit Shabaro. On the second floor, we were to live in an apartment which had stone floors or some kind of hard floors, and balconies on all sides, with a lighthouse right in front of us, and the sea visible not far away. A unique apartment, a unique location, and very conveniently situated within walking distance of the campus. And the campus itself, of course, was a very unique institution, situated directly on the Mediterranean Sea, and with magnificent shrubs and trees, most of which were still blooming, like the oleanders and various other planted things. And I had an office in the oldest building of the campus called College Hall, built somewhere around the 1860s. And the work was very pleasant in an office where one could always look out the window to relax one's eyes and one's mind and look out on the life and the blue sea, often can one say a school or a herd of porpoises tearing through the water, or attractive little boats and some big steamers. And of course it was very tempting sometimes between lectures to go down to the dock and take a swim or go on a little rowboat or something of the sort. A very unusual academic life, to be sure. Of course, the basic nature of the country, Lebanon and its neighbors, was that it was ancient land that was civilized or developed by human beings some 7,000 years at least before our time. And as a historian, it was particularly fascinating to view the remains of ancient civilization, in this case Roman temples, some Greek remains, and old Islamic or Arab ruins, which demanded to be explored as time permitted. Although I was not an ancient historian, it stimulated, of course, my view of history and my perspective of our own place in human civilization. That is, where do Western Europe and the United States and America and so on fit into a history which was begun by the peoples of Africa and Asia. And as with the discovery of rare books in Berlin, it was the discovery of ancient remains in Lebanon and the surroundings that enriched our life. There were other Americans, of course, who also shared this interest in the ancient history and remains of same. so that we went on trips with some friends occasionally to explore tells. Tells are little mounds or hills which covered a village, an ancient village or town, and which one could often identify by seeing pieces of ceramic, potsherds, and possibly glass, maybe even coins, which told a story about the places that we visited. Some of this was available very near Beirut, almost within walking distance. One place right near the airport had remains of Roman ceramics lying right on top of the beach sand. And on one occasion, Margaret and I went out to that place, started digging in the beach sand with our very hands, and landed a huge Roman storage jar, almost a yard, perhaps 30 inches long, which was broken in half, but inside was another small jug which was not broken. So we extricated that, took it home, emptied it of sand and so on, and it still stands among our exhibit, in our exhibit of ancient objects in our living room today. That was the beginning of our archaeological explorations, purely dilettantish, of course, but at any rate very exciting. And we went back to that place again and again to find Roman coins lying right on top of the sand after a rainstorm. Interesting experience too, to have students who were not American or European, but Oriental, Arabs, or Christian Arabs for that matter, who spoke enough English to be able to take courses in European history taught in English. They had to write term papers in English, and on the whole did remarkably well. Amongst these students, the students from the former Palestine or Palestinians were the most industrious and intelligent, I think, but also some people like the Armenians and Ethiopians even stood out on the whole as being industrious and intelligent. So on the whole, this teaching of foreign students was unproblematical, and at that time at least very little politicizing, such as has occurred in subsequent years, where factions were at each other's throat and actually deeds of violence were perpetrated on and against the campus. The worst outrage was the assassination of the university president, Malcolm Kerr, quite some years ago, and then more recently the bombing of College Hall, the very building in which I had my office. So we were fortunate in avoiding all this, or most of this, while we were in Beirut. Only after 3 years, in 1958, a revolution broke out in Iraq, and as well as in Egypt, which extended to Lebanon and also to AUB, and made life a little precarious. Shooting was heard on the streets, and there was a curfew after 7 or so. We weren't supposed to appear on the streets anymore, and so on and so forth. So in that atmosphere, a telegram which reached me from Bonn, of all places, introduced a totally new factor in our life. The telegram asked me whether I would be interested to possibly accept the post of Executive Secretary of the Fulbright Commission. Well, that was a gift from heaven at that particular juncture, and of course I replied I would be interested. And before long the confirmation of the offer came through, and once more we were about to pack our bags and move to another country. On the whole, our family had adjusted to the conditions in Lebanon to a considerable extent. You kids were going to school. I think Susie at the American school, and you were at was it a German school or English school? I forget. At any rate, both of you were adjusted to life there, although we had to exercise caution as to where we played, what we touched, what we ate, and so on, to avoid contamination from various bugs and diseases and so on. But we escaped most of that. But we did look forward to the possibility of being able to play outdoors, run around on the grass and so on in Germany, where life would be once again civilized. Well, it was quasi-civilized in Lebanon, but it was, after all, Oriental, and we were really outsiders, especially since we did not learn Arabic, and even my French wasn't good enough to follow their French conversation, in many cases at least. We had, by the way, a very nice little housekeeper in Beirut called Mimi, who came, I think, from Damascus, and who most of the time was very cheerful, helpful, although she had some problems on her own with regard to her boyfriend and so on and so forth. Incidentally, it was also a delightful coincidence that in the apartment upstairs, a family was living that had also worked in Berlin, Tracy Strong, and who turned out not only to have known Margaret, but to have been a, so to speak, distant relative of the Robbins family. A very nice man. By the way, Tracy Strong was the vice president of an international college in Beirut. A strong, tall man who also played a powerful game of tennis. I played at the faculty tennis club occasionally and enjoyed the company of other faculty members in that club. At any rate, while we had sufficient, I'm getting stuck. Can you break it off here? My thoughts are getting mixed up. Our lives in Lebanon were balanced by the fact that during the summer, the long summer vacation, we would go elsewhere to cool off. Most of our Arab friends went to the mountains to cool off in the summer, but we decided to go north to Germany, to Bavaria, to Berlin, to Vienna. Our first trip took us through Istanbul, where we stayed at the Hilton Hotel and where we enjoyed magnificent views and visits of the harbor and of museums and so on. The view of the Bosporus with its Arab buildings, and of course the Oriental life in the bazaar and so on were very unforgettable experiences. In fact, we thought of Istanbul as being a halfway stop to the cultivated civilization in the north. In other words, number one, or rather the bottom, was the world of the Near East, and on number two, Istanbul was somewhere between the ancient Near East and Western Europe, and then number three would be Germany, where life would be cultivated, rich, and safe. We stopped in Berlin at a pension, visiting old friends, like the von Kresses and Raedslobes and others. And we wondered where we could spend the rest of the summer, where the children could play, and where we grown-ups could take excursions in the country and so on. And as we visited a friend of mother's, Frau von Stein, near Munich, she suggested that we go to a small hotel, I suppose you call it, in Jachenau, in the Bavarian foothills or Alps, you might say. And they were able to take us in. In those days it was remarkably economical, remarkably cheap to stay at a place like that with children. I think they didn't even charge for the two children. At any rate, stayed at this barn house, or glorified barn house in Jachenau, and you children just took to the fields and woods with alacrity, playing. I think we still have some slides and pictures of that period which you have seen. Jachenau was a quiet, lovely valley, somewhat remote from the main traffic which went on to Mittenwald and Innsbruck. One had to go around a lake to get there. I forget what the name of the lake was, but at any rate, remote. Tante B came, no, not Tante B, Lily Peck came to visit us. Borwin came to visit us. In fact, you know, our life has been at places where friends and acquaintances came to visit, whether that was Berlin or Beirut or Bonn. Everywhere people came to these places because there were other attractions that brought friends there. And of course, finally, when we moved to Washington, that would be even more the case. At any rate, we enjoyed the visit at Jachenau thoroughly. And the second summer, we decided once again to spend somewhere in the north. Turned out to be at a place that was recommended in Vienna, or rather from Vienna we went to Kärnten, Carinthia, to a little town called Krumpendorf. And just above Krumpendorf was a castle called Schloss Hallig, and there we stayed for about 4 weeks or so. Lovely place, lovely surroundings. We had 2 rooms up in the castle where we heard the geese and the pigs and so on down below, and looked out on the lovely landscape where in the distance there was a church called Maria Saal, as I still recall. And there were many other beautiful churches in the neighborhood, such as Maria Wörth, right on the lake, Wörthersee. And among the diversions at the Schloss, was occasional hike through the woods to pick mushrooms. And you, Greg, were particularly anxious and interested in gathering Pfefferlinge, gathered them in your raincoat and brought them home. But I don't think you enjoyed eating them. But and there were other things to gather. I think we picked raspberries and elderberries, maybe even, and blackberries and whatnot. And Mother and Susie found a place to ride a horse. I think it was kind of a field horse, if I recall, but at any rate, nearby, where we also went for some food, I think an occasional meal or so. And you had a good time with the other children in the Schloss Halleck when there were parties and other diversions. And all around, I think it was a very lovely, peaceful environment that we'll never forget. I think on that trip, that second trip north, we went through Greece, stopped at Athens, and we lived in a hotel right near one of the main squares, and we found a girl who would take care of you and Susie while we went off on excursions in the neighborhood, such as Cap Sunion, a marvelous Doric temple on the sea, just east of Athens, and another trip south through Corinth. And I don't know how much further we went, but at any rate, those were very revealing, exciting, enriching trips, which added another dimension to our experience in the ancient world. I went for a second visit to Greece in the third summer, whereas when we were about to move to Bonn, you decided to go to Lincoln, or Mother decided to take you to Lincoln to spend most of the summer there, whereas I went to Greece. There was an interesting experience. The first trip we took with the bus, we missed getting because we got to the departure place too late. So we hopped into a taxi and told him to go out on the highway and try to find that bus. And by golly, the taxi rushed out there, spotted the bus, placed himself in front of the bus and made the driver come out and take us in, because we had subscribed to that trip. And then went on to Corinth and the rest of the places. Next summer, next year, when I was there alone, I once again subscribed to that bus trip. And by golly, the same lady who was the tour guide was on this bus too. And she said, "Oh yes, I remember you last summer not getting coming late to the bus." So it was lots of fun. And with me was a colleague from the AUB who also wanted to take trips in Greece, and we had a nice companionship there for a few days. I went to some other places I hadn't gone to before, such as Delphi, and what was the Epidaurus, the grand amphitheater, Greek amphitheater, where I saw a Greek play being produced. At any rate, these were all just wonderful experiences. But I looked forward to getting to Bonn, or Bad Godesberg, the suburb, where we were assigned a small apartment in the near the American Embassy quarters. And so in, July, I think it was, 1958, I went to Godesberg while you three went to Lincoln. And these first days were just revealing as to the quality of life that we would have there, right? Living on the Rhine River with its lively boat traffic, and living on the edge of the forest, this so-called cotton forest, where one could hike or bike in so many ways and so conveniently. I also went to Bonn to buy furniture for our apartment, which was all very tempting, beautifully made and beautifully styled furniture, some of which we still have, like Mother's desk up in the bedroom. And of course I also went to the piano store and looked around and saw a small harpsichord there, what's it called? Well, a small harpsichord in any case, with a lovely silvery tone, which I couldn't resist, and I ordered it right away to be sent out to the apartment. And I still remember the salesman inquiring from some other places whether this American who came around could be trusted, or was he going to get this instrument and not pay for it. Apparently he was reassured, and the same evening this instrument arrived. And I think I used every spare minute after that to play on it, because it was just so unique, so satisfying. But I was alone, and I was getting extremely restless about living a kind of unsystematic bachelor's life. And I couldn't wait for the time that you would arrive. But perhaps you remember arriving in Bremen on the Berlin. It must have been a lovely steamship ride. I think Mother came over as an escort for the Fulbright students. And so you came to Bremen and then took the train down to Bonn. And there you were received by me with an embassy diplomatic car that took us to our new abode in Godesberg. And, well, the rest of the story you probably remember, because you were sent to school within walking distance of the apartment. And you and Susie, were they both in the same school? I guess you were in the same school at first, at any rate. And my work involved going to the embassy every noon when an embassy car would pick me up, take me there to discuss the work of the Fulbright Commission with officials there. And that same embassy car would take me back to the house. I'd have lunch, all very leisurely indeed. And after lunch I would walk through the beautiful Stadtpark with its pond and the swans and other attractions. So you can see life was very leisurely, very balanced, very harmonious. And the work itself very fascinating. administration of the exchange of German students with to America, and American students and faculty, of course, to Germany, which gave one a wonderful insight into academic life, both in Germany as well as in the United States. And it was exciting to see how most of these Fulbright students adjusted to and blossomed even in the German academic environment, which was especially true of the music students who came to Germany to study music in universities and conservatory and so on, and found that their training, their accomplishments were much appreciated by the German theaters, German stages, opera stage and so on, to an extent that they could never hope to have in the United States, because there just weren't that many operatic and musical establishments as in Germany. And some of the Fulbright students even would stay on and become professionals in Germany. Some made it to the Metropolitan Opera House eventually and so on. So it was a very fruitful, very enriching program. But again, I had to ask myself, how long should I stay here? Should the children grow up like German children, or are they American children who should grow up there in America? So after about 2 years, I decided to leave and accept a visiting professorship at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. So again, rather reluctantly, I at least packed up and prepared to go back, because professionally it was important to get back to teaching. But as a human being, I felt that life in Godesberg was pleasanter than it could be in the United States, because of the well-organized society, the beauty of the surroundings, and of the accomplishments of Germans in administrating their cities and their society and so on. It was wonderful to be bicycling along the Rhine River or up in the woods without any danger to one in those days, and with associating with many people of similar spirits. All that was very, very enriching, and I was reluctant to leave it. But at the same time, I asked myself, should I get back to teaching, and should the children grow up in this country or in Germany? Well, the decision was made, as I said, and so in September 1958, we took the train up to Bremen and Bremerhaven and boarded the Hanseatic, I think it was called. Had a great time on that ship with the Fulbrighters, German Fulbrighters going to America on the same boat. Got to New York City, and I think we were received there by Chris, who had some sort of a job in New York City while he was studying at, what's the name of the college that Antioch, that's right. And Antioch had programs for students to work during vacation as part of their college experience. At any rate, he met us in New York City. Then we took the train down to Greensboro, and friends there took us to our future house at Len Wright's house on Market Street.